They handed her the poison cup themselves, and then they called it mercy. Duke Elowen Vaine did not look his daughter in the eye when he signed the exile decree. He looked at the candle instead, watching the flame bend in the draught, as if the fire were easier to face than the girl he had raised for 19 years. Lady Elowen Vaine stood in chains of soft silk rope. Nobles were not bound in iron, only in shame, while her cousin Maris wept into a lace handkerchief that had never once touched a real tear. "I loved her like a sister," Maris sobbed, and the court believed her because court always believes the one who cries prettiest. Elowen said nothing. She had learned in 19 years under that roof that innocence has no vocabulary the powerful care to translate. They marched her past the gates of Threnvale at dawn, toward the black tree line of the Ashen Reach, a land sealed for 200 years because whatever lived past that ward line was said to eat noblemen for breakfast and leave the bones as a warning. The guards unlocked the seal, shoved her through, and did not wait to hear if she screamed. What they did not know, what none of them could have imagined, was that the monsters on the other side of that wall were about to make her a queen. There is a particular kind of loneliness that only exists inside a full house. Elowen Vaine had lived in that loneliness since she was 7 years old, since the night her mother died of a fever and her father, hollowed out by grief, had let his late brother's daughter move into the room beside his own, while Elowen was quietly moved to the east wing, the wing the servants called the cold side because the sun never quite reached it. Nobody announced the demotion. Nobody had to. In great houses, love is measured in square footage and seating order, and Elowen had learned to read her worth in the distance between her chair and her father's at the dinner table. Maris, her cousin, had arrived at the Vaine estate as a frightened orphan of 8, and within a year she had become the daughter Duke Corwin actually looked at. She had his late brother's laugh, his late brother's quick tongue, and Elowen suspected, though she never said it aloud, his late brother's gift for making people feel chosen. Maris could walk into a room, and within a minute the room believed it had been waiting for her. Elowen had never learned that trick. She had inherited her mother's stillness instead, a quiet that people mistook for coldness, and coldness in a house that prized charm above honesty was its own kind of crime. "You should smile more," Maris told her once, when they were both 15, standing in front of the long mirror in the east wing before a banquet neither of them wanted to attend. "Uncle says a vain woman who does not smile looks like she is plotting something." "Maybe I am," Elowen said, and Maris had laughed, the bright, delighted laugh that made servants turn their heads, the laugh that made people forgive her anything. It took Elowen 4 more years to understand that the laugh was a weapon, sharpened on every soft thing it touched. The insight is not complicated, though it takes most people a lifetime to learn it. Charm is not character. A warm laugh can sit on top of a cold calculation the way frost sits on top of still water, beautiful and completely misleading about what moves underneath. Elowen would have given anything at 19 to have been taught that lesson before it cost her everything. Instead, she learned it the way most people learn the truths that matter, too late to use it and too thoroughly to ever forget it. The trouble began, as these things always do, with a marriage that hadn't happened yet. Crown Prince Talon Ashworth had come to Vaine Hall for the autumn accords, a formality, a political courtesy between 2 old houses, and within one evening it had become obvious to every servant carrying wine that the prince's eyes kept finding Elowen across the hall and staying there. She had not sought it. She had, if anything, tried to disappear into the tapestries the way she always did at these functions, because attention in that house had never once led anywhere good for her. But Talon had asked the steward her name twice, had requested she be seated nearer the high table, had in the small, careless way princes do things without understanding the weight they carry, smiled at her 3 separate times. Maris had counted. Elowen knew she had counted because she watched her cousin's face rearrange itself over the course of that single dinner, watched the warmth in it cool by degrees until what was left looked like glass. Glass that had decided quietly that it was going to become a knife. "You looked lovely tonight," Maris told her afterward in the hallway outside their rooms, and her voice was so gentle, so sisterly, that a stranger would have wept at the tenderness of it. The prince certainly thought so. "It was nothing," Elowen said, because it had felt like nothing, a few glances, a few polite words, the kind of attention that evaporated the moment the carriage pulled away. She did not yet understand that, in a house like Vaine Hall, nothing was the most dangerous word in the language, because nothing was exactly what people used as the foundation for everything. 3 weeks later, the family steward, an old man named Bellamy who had served 3 generations of Vaines and loved none of them more than he loved his own skin, discovered a vial of white powder hidden in the lining of Elowen's traveling case. He discovered it conveniently on the very morning that Duke Corwin had received a letter, unsigned, delivered by a courier no one could later trace, informing him that his daughter had been overheard discussing removing obstacles to a royal engagement. Elowen did not know, standing in her father's study an hour later with her heart trying to climb up through her throat, that the vial had been sewn into her case 2 nights prior by a maid who owed Maris a debt she could not otherwise repay. She did not know that the letter had been written in a hand practiced, over several discarded drafts, to look nothing like Maris's own. She only knew that her father was staring at a small glass vial on his desk, the way a man stares at a wound he has just noticed is already turning black, and that when he finally looked up at her, there was no question in his eyes at all. "Only verdict, tell me it isn't true," he said, and it was not a request for information. It was a request for permission to believe the version of events that had already been decided for him, so that he would not have to do the harder work of doubting the daughter he had spent 12 years learning not to look at too closely. "Father, I have never." The prince's own guard intercepted a second letter this morning, Corwin said, and his voice cracked on the word guard, not from grief for her. Elowen would understand years later, but from the horror of imagining his own family name dragged before a royal tribunal. Addressed to an alchemist in the lower quarter, requesting a compound that mimics natural causes. "I wrote no such letter, then who did?" he asked, and the question hung in the air between them like an accusation shaped like a door with only one way through it. Elowen looked past her father's shoulder and found Maris standing in the study entrance. One hand pressed to her mouth in an expression of perfect camera-ready devastation, and in that single frozen second Elowen finally understood, completely irreversibly, exactly whose hand had built this door and exactly how thoroughly she had already been shoved through it. "I would never harm him," she said quietly, because it was the only true thing left to say, and true things she was learning in real time in the worst possible classroom had stopped being currency in this house a long time ago. Her father did not answer her. He rang the bell for the household guard instead, and somewhere behind her so softly that only Elowen ever heard it, Maris exhaled the small, satisfied breath of someone setting down a weight they had been carrying for exactly as long as it took to make sure it landed on someone else. The tribunal that decided Elowen's fate lasted less than an hour, which tells you everything you need to know about how much the truth actually mattered to the people in that room. House tribunals were not designed to discover facts. They were designed to protect reputations, and Elowen's guilt was. From the very first gavel strike the outcome that protected the most reputations at once. The Duke, S for having raised no traitor the crown, S for having nearly been endangered by no real threat, and Maris's, whose tears had already convinced half the room that she was the true victim in this story, the loyal cousin who had suspected something was wrong for weeks and prayed she was mistaken. Elowen was given exactly 4 minutes to speak in her own defense. She used them to describe, plainly and without theatrics, the timeline of the vial's discovery and the impossibility of her having written a letter in a hand that was not her own. Nobody in the room examined the handwriting. Nobody asked why an assassination plot would be conducted through traceable letters instead of the discretion that actual conspirators used. The tribunal did not want answers. It wanted an ending, quickly, before the scandal could travel further than the walls of Vaine Hall, and Elowen had the terrible misfortune of being the ending that required the least additional damage to anyone who mattered. "Exile," the presiding magistrate said, and the word landed in the hall like a dropped blade. "Beyond the ward line into the Ashen Reach, effective at dawn, the house name of Vaine is to remain unblemished by association. Lady Elowen Vaine is from this hour no daughter of this house." Her father signed the decree without looking up from the desk. Elowen watched his hand move across the parchment and understood, with the strange clarity that comes only in the worst moments of a life, that he was not signing away a criminal. He was signing away a problem, and the fact that the problem happened to be his own blood had simply made the signature a little heavier, not impossible. A single voice in that tribunal had wavered, Bellamy, the old steward. Standing at the back of the hall, with the vial's discovery report clutched in his hands, had hesitated just once when the magistrate asked him to confirm the exact location he'd found it. And for one brief moment, Elowen had let herself hope that decades of loyal service to her mother's memory might finally outweigh whatever debt or fear kept him quiet. But the hesitation passed, swallowed by the same instinct for self-preservation that ruled every corner of that house, and Bellamy delivered his testimony exactly as rehearsed, and the last flicker of hope Elowen allowed herself in that tribunal hall went out with it. "You'll thank me one day," Maris whispered to her in the corridor afterward, close enough that no guard could hear it, far enough that it would never be repeated in any tribunal. You were never built for this house, Elowen. I'm only helping you become what you were always going to become anyway. There is a lesson buried inside cruelty like that if you are willing to look for it, though it is a bitter one to swallow. The people who hurt you most convincingly are rarely strangers. Strangers do not know where your softest places are. It takes intimacy to aim that precisely, and it takes a particular kind of person to use that intimacy as a map instead of a trust. Elowen did not answer her cousin. She simply memorized the shape of Maris's smile in that hallway, because someday she promised herself with a calm that surprised even her, she intended to see that same smile break. The walk to the ward line took most of the night. She was not permitted a horse, only a plain gray traveling cloak and a single waterskin, escorted by 2 guards who spoke to her as little as possible, as though her disgrace might be contagious. The Ashen Reach began where the kingdom's cultivated hills gave way to blackened, ash-colored earth that no crop had grown in for 2 centuries, since the old bond magic between humans and the creatures called the kindred had been outlawed, and the border sealed by a ward no living person fully understood anymore. Children in Threnvale were raised on stories of the Reach, stories of claws in the dark, of travelers who wandered too close to the border and were never seen again, of a land so cursed that even birds refused to fly over it. This is where traitors belong, the elder guard said, unlocking the section of the ward wall reserved for exactly this purpose, a narrow iron gate rusted from disuse. Beyond it, the tree line was so dense and so dark it looked less like a forest and more like a mouth. Whatever's in there will finish what the tribunal started, faster probably, kinder some say. Elowen said nothing. She had run out of words for people who had already decided what she was. The gate groaned open. The guard did not push her, he did not need to. She walked through it on her own feet, because if this was going to be the last thing that ever happened to her, she intended to meet it standing upright the way her mother had taught her to face everything. Long before her mother had died and left her alone in a house that mistook her grief for something to be embarrassed by. The gate slammed shut behind her with a sound like a verdict being carried out, and the lock turned, and the guard's footsteps retreated into the dark. And Elowen Vaine stood alone at the edge of a forest that had swallowed 2 centuries of warnings, listening to something enormous shift in the underbrush 30 feet away, its breathing slow, deliberate, and very, very close. The first night in the Ashen Reach, Elowen did not sleep. She sat with her back against a boulder, blackened by some old fire that must have burned decades ago, her knees pulled to her chest, listening to a forest that never quite went silent, not the comfortable murmur of wind through leaves that she remembered from the Vaine gardens, but something with weight to it, footsteps too heavy for any deer calls that started as birdsong and dropped halfway through into something closer to a growl. She had expected to die within hours. By the time the ash-gray dawn finally bled through the canopy, she found she had not. And the surprise of that, the simple stubborn fact of still being alive, became the first thing in weeks that felt like it belonged to her rather than to whoever last decided her fate for her. She survived the first 3 days on instinct and the water skin, learning quickly which plants the ash soil could still support and which had gone the color of rot. On the 4th day, hunger made her careless, and she wandered too far from the boulder toward the sound of running water, and that was when she found the creature. It was enormous, twice the size of the largest hunting hound she'd ever seen at Vaine Hall, with a hide the color of dried blood and eyes an unnatural luminous amber. And it was lying on its side in a shallow ravine with an arrow buried deep in its shoulder, breathing in shallow, ragged pulls that told her even from 30 feet away that it did not have much longer left in it. Every story she had ever been told said she should run. Every instinct her body possessed screamed at her to run. But Elowen had spent 19 years learning exactly what it felt like to be looked at as a problem to be disposed of rather than a creature to be helped, and something in her, something that had been waiting, she would realize much later. For exactly this moment, refused to let another living thing die that way if she had it in her power to stop it. "I'm not going to hurt you," she said aloud, absurdly, to a beast that could tear her in half with one motion, and inched closer with her hands open and empty. The creature's amber eyes tracked her, and it made a sound low in its chest that was not quite a growl, more a warning wrapped around exhaustion, but it did not lunge. She reached the arrow with her heart slamming against her ribs and pulled it free in one motion. The way she had once seen a Vaine Hall huntsman treat an injured falcon, and the creature screamed, a sound that shook loose ash from the branches above them, and then astonishingly went still. She packed the wound with moss and pressure the way her old nurse had once shown her for smaller injuries, staying with the beast through the night, as its breathing evened, and somewhere in the deep hours before dawn half delirious with hunger and cold. Elowen fell asleep with her back against its flank because it was absurdly the warmest and safest she had felt in longer than she could remember. When she woke, the creature was gone. She thought at first that it had simply left, healed enough to return to whatever life it had before the arrow found it, and something in her ached at the loss of it more than she expected. But 3 days later, starving feverish, and half convinced she had finally begun to die, she found a fresh kill laid across the boulder she had claimed as her camp. A rabbit cleanly killed left where only she would find it. And she understood with a shock that ran straight through her exhaustion that something out here had decided she was worth keeping alive. The lesson in that, though it would take her weeks to fully understand it, was one that the Vaine household had spent 19 years trying to teach her the opposite of, that mercy is never wasted. Even when, especially when, it is offered to something the world has told you to fear. Her family had taught her that kindness was a currency to be spent only on people who could repay it in status or favor. The Reach, in its brutal, wordless way, was teaching her something closer to the truth, that the things worth trusting are rarely the ones who smile the widest, and are far more often the ones who simply, quietly choose not to abandon you. There were nights in that first month when the hunger grew bad enough that she caught herself bargaining with a god she wasn't sure she believed in anymore, promising everything for a warm meal and a locked door. And it was in exactly one of those nights, curled against the boulder with her stomach cramping and her resolve fraying at the edges, that she heard the low growl of the duskrunners approaching for the first time, not as hunters circling something wounded, but as something closer to sentries, taking up positions at the edges of her camp as if they had been assigned the task. She did not understand it then. She would understand it much later, once Kale explained that the Reach had already begun, in its own slow and wordless way, deciding what she was worth protecting. She grew stronger through that first month in ways she could not entirely explain. The rabbit became a pattern, food left at dawn, sometimes fish, once a whole haunch of something larger she chose not to examine too closely. And in exchange, she began leaving offerings of her own wildflowers, a braided cord of grass. Small, useless things that were really just a language she was inventing, as she went a way of saying "I see you" back to whatever was watching her from the tree line. She began to notice eyes in the underbrush that no longer felt like threats. She began to hear, in the calls that dropped from birdsong into something rougher, something that almost sounded like conversation, if she let herself listen closely enough. She did not yet know that the Ashen Reach had a ruler. She did not know that every creature watching her from the shadows had already sent word in whatever wordless way. The kindred spoke to each other across their territory, that a human girl had pulled an arrow from a wounded elder beast and stayed through the night rather than running. And that the one who ruled this land had heard that report, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, had felt something close to curiosity about a human being. She found out exactly how much that curiosity mattered on the 40th night, when she woke to the sound of something enormous moving through her camp, with a silence that should have been impossible for something that size, and opened her eyes to find a man, or something wearing the shape of a man, crouched 3 feet away, watching her with eyes the exact luminous amber of the beast she had saved, waiting with an unreadable patience for her to finally wake up and ask him who he was. Elowen did not scream. She would think back on that moment often in the months that followed and be quietly proud of that fact, because every reasonable part of her understood that screaming was exactly the reaction a predator expected, and this creature, this man, if that was even the right word for him, was watching her the way a hunter watches something he has not yet decided whether to call prey. "You're the one who pulled the arrow," he said. His voice was low, unhurried, carrying an accent she didn't recognize, older than anything spoken within the ward. Up close in the gray pre-dawn light, she could see that his eyes were not merely amber-colored, but genuinely luminous, catching what little light there was the way an animal's eyes do. And there was something at the edge of his jaw, a faint pattern like old scarring, that shifted when she looked at it directly into something closer to fur before settling back into skin. "You were watching," she said, refusing to let her voice shake. "The whole time. The Reach watches everything that crosses the ward line. Most of what crosses it does not survive long enough to be worth watching twice." He tilted his head, an oddly animal gesture on an otherwise human frame. "You are the first in longer than I can count who has." "Who are you?" "Kale," he said, as if the single name should mean something, and when her face told him it didn't, something that might have been amusement passed briefly through those unsettling eyes. "They stopped teaching your kind the old names 2 centuries ago. Convenient for the ones who wrote your history books." She should have been afraid. She was afraid somewhere underneath the exhaustion and the hunger and the 40 days of learning to survive on instinct alone. But fear had become such a constant companion since the night of her tribunal that she had lost the ability to let it stop her from asking the questions she needed answered. The elder beast, the one I helped, it's yours, mine to protect. Not mine to command, not the way your people mean the word. He crouched lower, studying her with an intensity that made her feel, for the first time in 19 years, genuinely seen rather than merely looked at. Give me your hand. Why? Because I want to confirm something, and I would rather not be wrong about it. When she hesitated, he added, quieter, I have had 4 decades to kill anything that crossed this line. If killing were what I intended, you would already be dead. There was a brutal logic to that which she couldn't argue with, and some instinct, the same instinct that had told her not to run from a dying elder beast, told her to trust it now. She held out her hand. Kale took it in both of his, turning her palm upward, and pressed 2 fingers against the base of her wrist the way a physician checks a pulse, except his eyes had gone distant, listening for something she couldn't perceive at all. Old blood, he said finally, and something in his voice had changed, not warmer exactly, but sharper, more alert. The way a man sounds when a puzzle he'd stopped expecting to solve suddenly produces an answer. Diluted, buried under generations of your people pretending it was never there. But it's there, I don't understand. Your family name, he said. Vaine, her stomach dropped. How do you know that? Because 200 years ago, before the Sundering, before your kingdom decided the old bond between your people and mine was heresy worth burning libraries over, House Vaine was one of the first bloodlines to carry it. The Beast Bond. The gift that let certain humans reach the kindred not through fear or force, but through something closer to kinship. He released her hand, and she felt the absence of his grip more than she wanted to admit. Your ancestors didn't fear this forest, Elowen Vaine. Some of them ruled beside it. The insight landed in her chest like something shifting into place after being wrong for a very long time, the quiet, uncomfortable click of understanding that everything she had been taught about herself, about her worth, about what kind of person she was allowed to be, had been built on a foundation someone else had poured 2 centuries before she was even born, and had never once been the whole truth. Her family had spent generations teaching itself to fear the very thing that ran, dormant and unclaimed, in her own blood. They had exiled her to a land that it turned out was not a punishment at all, but the first place in her entire life that recognized exactly what she was. Why does it matter now, she asked. The bond, if that's even what this is. Why does any of this matter if the Reach was just going to kill me anyway? Because it didn't, Kale said simply, and because the Reach does not forget an old bloodline just because your kingdom did. You saved one of mine without being asked, without being commanded, without anything to gain from it. That is the entire test the old bond was ever built on, and you passed it without knowing you were being examined. He rose to his full height, and for the first time she registered how much larger than her he truly was, how much of the forest's stillness seemed to gather around him like something obedient. The question now is whether you want to learn what that blood is actually capable of, or whether you'd prefer to spend the rest of your life in this forest as nothing more than a very well-fed prisoner. Elowen thought of Maris's perfect, camera-ready tears. She thought of her father's hand signing the exile decree without once looking up. She thought of a court that had needed less than an hour to decide she was disposable, and of a whole kingdom that would, by now, already be telling itself the comfortable story that she was dead, that the Reach had done exactly what everyone expected it to do. Teach me, she said, and somewhere in the dark tree line around them, dozens of amber eyes she hadn't even noticed watching turned, as one toward the sound of her voice. The training that followed did not look like anything Elowen would have imagined. She had expected, if she had expected anything at all, something resembling the sword drills the Vaine Hall guards had once practiced in the courtyard, discipline built on repetition and command. What Kale taught her instead was closer to unlearning than learning, unlearning the reflex to see the kindred as monsters, unlearning 19 years of flinching, unlearning the particular arrogance the Threnvale nobility carried without even realizing they carried it. The quiet assumption that anything without a human face existed to serve or to threaten, and nothing in between. The old bond was never about control, Kale told her on the 7th week. As she sat cross-legged in a clearing with a young kindred creature, smaller than the elder beast, quick and skittish, something between a wolf and something with too many joints to be entirely canine, circling her at a wary distance. Your ancestors made that mistake eventually too, near the end, and it's part of why the Sundering happened in the first place. They started trying to command the kindred the way they commanded servants. The bond doesn't answer to command, it answers to truth. Truth, Elowen repeated, watching the young creature's ears flatten every time she moved too quickly. It can tell when you're lying, not with words, with something older than words. If you sit there and pretend to feel calm when you're furious, or pretend to feel safe when you're terrified, it will know, and it will treat you exactly the way you'd treat someone lying to your face. He nodded toward the creature. Stop performing patience. Actually be patient. It took her 3 more weeks to understand what he meant, and the understanding when it finally arrived felt less like a skill and more like an old memory surfacing. The sense that this quiet, honest way of being with another creature was not new to her at all, but something her body had simply forgotten it knew how to do. By the 11th week, the young kindred crossed the clearing on its own and pressed its narrow skull against her open palm. And Elowen felt something settle into place in her chest that she had spent her entire life at Vaine Hall without ever once experiencing. The plain, uncomplicated feeling of being trusted by something that had no political reason to trust her. There is a version of this lesson that applies well beyond forests full of monsters, though it took the forest to teach it to her properly. The people and creatures worth keeping close are rarely won through performance. Maris had built an entire life on performance, on tears delivered at the precise moment they'd do the most damage, on charm calibrated to whichever audience was watching, and it had won her a duke's favor and a prince's attention and a tribunal's mercy. But performance cannot be trusted the way honesty can, because performance only ever answers to what an audience wants to see, and audiences change. Elowen was learning, in a forest her own kingdom called Cursed, that the rarest and strongest bonds are the ones built on the parts of yourself you're not performing at all. Not every lesson came gently. There was a season near the end of the first year, when a rival pack of duskrunners from the far edge of the Reach challenged the young creature she had bonded with in the clearing, and Elowen, still half-thinking in the old Vaine Hall logic of hierarchy and dominance, tried to intervene by force. Planting herself between the two packs with her arms spread as if sheer will alone could command a truce. She was thrown to the ground for her trouble, bruised and humiliated, and it was Kale who pulled her back rather than let the lesson finish teaching itself the hard way. "You cannot borrow authority you haven't earned," he told her afterward, cleaning a shallow cut along her forearm with more gentleness than his words carried. "Your ancestors made that exact mistake before the Sundering. They assumed the bond meant they could stand between any two creatures and simply be obeyed, because obedience was the only shape of respect their own kingdom had ever taught them to recognize. The Reach doesn't work that way. You earn a voice in a conflict by understanding it first, not by shouting over it." The insight settled into her slowly, the way the most useful lessons tend to. Command without understanding is just another form of the arrogance that had gotten her exiled in the first place. The same arrogance her father wore when he signed her exile decree, without asking a single real question, the same arrogance Maris wore like perfume. Assuming her own certainty was reason enough to be believed, Elowen spent the following weeks simply observing the rival packs instead of intervening, learning the shape of their dispute, territory not malice, before she ever tried to stand between them again. And when she finally did offer herself as a mediator, the packs listened, because by then she had actually understood what she was mediating. Her relationship with Kale changed more slowly, in a way she found harder to name. He was not warm. Not in any conventional sense. Centuries of guarding a border most humans believed was a wasteland of monsters had worn most performative softness off him, the way water wears down stone. But he was honest with her in a way no one at Vaine Hall had ever bothered to be. And honesty, she was discovering, could feel more like tenderness than any amount of borrowed charm. He corrected her mistakes without cruelty. He told her plainly when he thought she was wrong. He listened, actually listened, in a way that made her realize, with a small ache, that she had spent 19 years having conversations with people who were only ever waiting for their turn to speak. "Why do you care whether I master this?" she asked him once, months in, as they sat at the edge of a ravine watching the ash-colored sunset bleed orange through the dead trees. "What does it cost you if I fail?" Kale was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer at all. "The last human to carry old blood into this forest," he said finally, "was your great-grandmother's grandmother. She came here by choice, not exile, seeking to renew the bond before the Sundering finished severing it entirely. She failed not because she lacked the gift, because she lacked the patience to let the bond be built rather than taken." His amber eyes found Elowen's in the fading light. "I have had 2 centuries to watch what happens to a bond forced instead of earned. I would rather not watch it happen again." It was as close to an admission of caring as he had allowed himself, and Elowen understood. Sitting there in the ash-colored dusk with a young kindred creature dozing against her knee, and a man who was not quite a man watching her, with an intensity he clearly didn't intend to name, that whatever this was building between them. It was the first entirely unforced thing she had been offered in longer than she could remember. It was 3 months later that the messenger hawk found her, an actual hawk, one of the last creatures still able to cross the ward line freely. carrying a scrap of parchment tucked into a hollow band around its leg, sent by the one servant at Vaine Hall who had never quite believed the official story of her guilt. The message was short. Crown Prince Talon Ashworth was to be formally betrothed within the season to Lady Maris Vaine, whom the court now openly credited with having saved the crown from a viper in noblewoman's clothing. House Vaine's standing at court had never been higher. Maris had not merely survived the scandal she manufactured, she had been crowned by it. Elowen read the message twice, folded it with hands that had gone very still, and looked up to find Cale watching her with an expression that told her he already understood. Before she said a single word, exactly what kind of storm had just crossed the ward line to reach her. "They think I'm dead," she said quietly. "Do you intend to correct them?" Cale asked, and behind him in the tree line, dozens of amber eyes turned toward her once more, waiting the way they had waited on the very first night to see what she would choose to become. She did not return that season, nor the one after it. Rage, Elowen was learning, made a poor architect. It built plans that collapsed the moment they met resistance, because Rage wanted satisfaction faster than the world was ever built to deliver it. What she wanted was not a single dramatic reckoning that Maris could weep her way out of in front of a sympathetic court. She wanted a return that could not be explained away, could not be tribunaled into someone else's fault, could not be met with a pretty handkerchief and a well-timed sob. Building that kind of return took time, and for the first time in her life, Elowen found she had an abundance of it. 2 years passed inside the Ashen Reach, and they reshaped her so completely that she sometimes caught her own reflection in still water and needed a moment to recognize the woman looking back. The beast bond, once merely a dormant inheritance, had become something closer to a second native language. She could stand at the center of a clearing and without a single spoken command, gather 24 kindred creatures around her simply by radiating the calm unperformed honesty Cale had first taught her. An elder beast twice the size of a warhorse. A pack of the quick wolfish creatures called duskrunners, even the rare and famously untrusting shardhawks that nested in the highest dead trees, and answered as far as anyone in Threnvale's history knew to absolutely nothing at all. She began in that second to travel the full breadth of the Reach with Cale at her side, meeting kindred she had never encountered in her first cautious months. The slow moss-backed stonewardens that guarded the deep ravines and spoke when they spoke at all. In a rumble too low for most human ears to catch the silver-eyed nightweavers that wove their homes into the canopy, and treated her early visits with a wary glittering suspicion that took the better part of a season to soften into something like welcome. Each new bond taught her a slightly different dialect of the same underlying truth Cale had first shown her. That trust, offered honestly and without an agenda attached, was a currency that never once devalued, no matter how many times she spent it. Cale taught her to fight too, though fight, undersold what it actually was, less swordplay than a kind of physical conversation with her own body's instincts, sharpened by 2 years of living somewhere that punished hesitation instantly and mercilessly. She learned to move the way the kindred moved, economical and unhurried, until the exact moment speed was required. She learned that her body, freed from 19 years of being taught to make itself smaller and quieter and less noticeable, had considerable strength that no one at Vaine Hall had ever bothered to help her discover, because a daughter's strength had never once been useful to the image the family wanted to present. The relationship between her and Cale deepened in the unhurried way that everything in the Reach seemed to deepen, not through declarations, which he distrusted on principle, having watched 2 centuries of humans make grand promises they broke within a season, but through the accumulation of small, consistent honesties. He sat with her through the nightmares that still occasionally dragged her back to the tribunal hall. She learned, over months, the rare and specific things that made him laugh, a low, surprised sound he seemed almost embarrassed by, as though laughter were a language he'd nearly forgotten how to speak. Neither of them named what was growing between them for a long time, because naming it felt to both of them like handing something fragile to a world that had already proven, on both their behalves, how carelessly it handled fragile things. "You could stay," Cale told her once, near the end of the 2nd year, on a night when the moon over the Reach turned the ash-colored earth almost silver. "Whatever happens in Threnvale will happen with or without you standing in the middle of it. You've built something here that no exile decree can undo." "I know," Elowen said, and meant it. The Reach had given her more genuine belonging in 2 years than Vaine Hall had offered in 19. "But there's a girl still locked in that house who never got to find out what she was capable of, because everyone around her decided the answer before she was old enough to ask the question herself. I'm not doing this for revenge anymore, Cale, not only for revenge." She looked at him in the silvered dark, and for once let him see everything she was actually feeling, unperformed. I'm doing it because somebody has to walk back through that gate and prove the story they told about what happened to me was a lie. Or the next girl the Vaine family decides is inconvenient gets exactly what I got, and nobody ever comes back to say otherwise. Cale studied her for a long moment, and something shifted behind his luminous eyes, not doubt, she realized, but something closer to recognition, the particular respect one survivor offers another when they understand, without needing it explained, exactly what a choice like that costs. Then you won't walk back alone, he said, and it was not a question. The news that finally set the date arrived 4 months later, carried by the same weathered messenger hawk. Delivered by the same quietly loyal servant who had risked her position twice now to make sure Elowen was never entirely cut off from the truth of what was happening inside Vaine Hall. Duke Corwin Vaine was dying, a wasting illness the physicians could not name, one that had crept over him steadily since the season of Elowen's exile, as though guilt itself had finally found a way to collect what it was owed. Maris, now formally betrothed to the Crown Prince, and functionally running the Vaine household in her uncle's decline, had begun quietly transferring assets, deeds, and titles into her own name, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had always intended the Duke's death to be the final tidy step in a plan she'd been executing for 2 years. She's not just stealing my inheritance, Elowen said, reading the letter a third time by firelight, her hands, for the first time in a long while, not entirely steady. She's making sure there's nothing left to inherit by the time anyone thinks to ask questions. Then we go now, Cale said, already rising, already calling wordlessly, in the old way she'd finally learned to hear, to every creature within a mile of their camp. Not to prove a story wrong to a court that never wanted to hear it. To stop her before your father becomes the last thing she takes. Elowen stood, feeling the weight of 2 years of training settle into her spine like armor she'd finally grown into, and looked toward the dark tree lines separating the Reach from the kingdom that had thrown her into it. Then let's give Threnvale something it spent 2 centuries being told to fear, she said, and let them finally understand why. The ward gate that had sealed behind her 2 years earlier had not been opened from the outside in longer than any living guard could remember. And it took 3 of the largest kindred in Cale's territory working in unison to tear the ancient iron loose from its rusted hinges, the sound of it echoing across the border hills like a bell tolling for something the kingdom thought long buried. Elowen walked through the wreckage of that gate at the head of a procession no one in Threnvale had a framework to understand, an elder beast the size of a warhorse at her right shoulder, a loping pack of duskrunners fanning ahead of her like scouts. Shardhawks wheeling overhead in slow, watchful circles, and beside her in the shape of a man that only barely contained what he actually was, Cale, the Lord of the Ashen Reach. Walking into the kingdom that had spent 2 centuries pretending his entire existence was a bedtime story meant to frighten children into staying inside the walls. Word reached the capital before she did, it always does. In a kingdom built on gossip disguised as diplomacy, and by the time Elowen's procession crested the last hill before Vaine Hall, half the household staff had already fled to the village below. Certain the stories about the Ashen Reach's monsters had finally come to collect on 200 years of unpaid fear. Villagers along the border road had lined the hillsides at a cautious distance, some falling to their knees at the sight of the elder beast, others simply staring in open silent disbelief at the woman leading the procession, whom several of the older villagers swore they recognized, despite 2 years of rumor insisting she was long dead. Elowen did not stop to correct them or comfort them. There would be time enough later for the kingdom to learn what to make of her. For now there was only the gate and the house beyond it, and the father whose failing health had finally forced her hand. She had expected fear. She had not fully prepared herself for what it would feel like to walk back through the front gates of the house that raised her, and find it smaller than she remembered, the gardens overgrown in places that used to be immaculate. The whole estate carrying the particular neglect of a household run by someone more interested in appearances at court than in the actual maintenance of the things she'd inherited. Maris met her in the entrance hall, and for one unguarded second, the only unguarded second Elowen would ever see cross her cousin's face, something like genuine terror flickered across her features before the mask reassembled itself into an expression of astonished, tearful joy. Elowen. Maris's voice caught perfectly on the syllables. You're alive. We thought everyone believed the Reach had taken you. We mourned you. I mourned you. Save it, Elowen said, and her voice, when she heard it herself, did not sound like the girl who had once accepted every one of Maris's performances as sincere. It sounded like someone who had spent 2 years learning to recognize a lie the instant it opened its mouth. I've had 2 years to learn what your tears are actually worth, Maris. They're worth exactly what they've always been worth, whatever you needed them to buy in the moment you produced them. Something behind Maris's eyes went cold and calculating in a way that dropped the last of the performance entirely. And for the first time, Elowen saw her cousin's actual face, unguarded, sharp, frightened, and furious to have been recognized so completely. You have no proof of anything, Maris said, her voice dropping the sob entirely. You're an exile who crawled back from a land that should have killed you, dragging monsters through my front gate. Do you understand how that looks to a court that already believes you're a poisoner? I understand exactly how it looks, Elowen said. It looks like a woman who was innocent found a way to survive what you built to destroy her, and came home with proof that the story you sold this kingdom was a lie from the very first word. She stepped closer, close enough to see the flicker of real fear return to Maris's eyes. Where is my father? The silence that followed lasted just long enough to answer the question on its own. Long enough for Elowen to feel Kale shift almost imperceptibly closer at her shoulder, long enough for one of the duskrunners at the doorway to lower its head and growl low and steady. At whatever it could smell on the air of that hall that Elowen couldn't yet name. He's resting, Maris said finally, too quickly. He's very ill, the physicians say any shock could. Take me to him, Elowen said. Now. And it was the flicker of genuine panic that crossed Maris's face at that exact request. Not at the monsters filling her entrance hall, not at the sister she'd exiled walking back through her front door. But specifically at the prospect of Elowen reaching her father before Maris had a chance to control what he was told. That confirmed more thoroughly than any tribunal ever could exactly how much her cousin still had left to hide. Duke Elowen Vaine had aged a decade in 2 years. Elowen found him in a darkened bedchamber that smelled of medicine and dust, his once imposing frame diminished to something fragile beneath layers of blankets. And the sight of him, genuinely dying, genuinely afraid, stirred something in her that surprised her with its complexity. She had spent 2 years imagining this reunion as a moment of triumph, and instead found it was simply sad, the particular sadness of watching a man reap exactly what his own cowardice had spent 2 decades planting. Elowen. His voice was a rasp, disbelieving, his eyes struggling to focus in the low candlelight. They said the Reach had taken you, they said. I know what they said, Elowen replied, kneeling beside the bed, and found to her own surprise that her voice came out gentler than she expected. 2 years of anger had not fully prepared her for the reality that the man in front of her was no longer the imposing figure who'd signed her exile without looking up. He was simply an old, frightened man who had finally run out of ways to avoid the consequences of his own choices. I need you to listen to me, Father, and I need you to actually hear it this time, instead of believing whatever version of the truth is easiest. She told him everything, the maid who had confessed 3 months prior, everything to the loyal servant, who'd been feeding Elowen information from the Reach, terrified of dying with the secret on her conscience. The unsigned letter written in a practiced hand, designed to mimic nothing in particular, except suspicion, the 2 years of assets Maris had quietly redirected under the cover of managing a dying man's affairs. Corwin listened with the particular stillness of a man watching his entire understanding of the last 2 years rearrange itself into a shape he did not want to see, and when Elowen finished, his eyes were wet in a way she had never once seen them. Not even at her mother's funeral. I signed it, he said so quietly she nearly missed it. I signed your exile without asking a single question I should have asked. I told myself I was protecting the family name. I was protecting my own comfort. I didn't want to believe you could have done it, and I didn't want to do the harder work of proving you hadn't, because proving it would have meant admitting Maris might have lied to me, and I had already decided somewhere along the way that I couldn't survive that particular disappointment twice. There is a version of justice that satisfies the part of a person that wants blood, and there is a version that actually heals something, and Elowen discovered, kneeling at her dying father's bedside, that she wanted the second kind far more than she'd ever expected. I'm not here for an apology, she said. I'm here because Maris is not finished. Whatever illness has been eating at you for 2 years, Father, I don't think it started on its own. Corwin's eyes widened, the pieces assembling themselves at last. The tea, he whispered. She's the only one who's insisted on preparing it herself every evening for over a year. The door slammed open before he could finish the thought, and Maris stood in the frame, any pretense of tears entirely abandoned, now a small vial clutched in one white-knuckled hand, not unlike. Elowen registered with a cold, distant clarity the very vial that had ended her old life 2 years earlier. You couldn't just stay dead, Maris said, and her voice, stripped of performance for the first time Elowen had ever witnessed, was flat and furious. I built all of this. The betrothal, the title, the household, I earned it piece by piece while you got to run off and play savior to a forest full of animals. I am not handing it back because you finally found proof. You poisoned your own uncle, Elowen said, slowly. For a year while calling it care. He was always going to die eventually, Maris said, and the words landed in the room like a confession she hadn't intended to give so plainly, the mask finally completely gone. I simply decided the timing should be convenient. Her eyes flicked past Elowen to the vial in her own hand, and something desperate crossed her face. The recognition, perhaps, that a confession spoken aloud in front of a dying man and the daughter she'd exiled was no longer a secret she could contain through tears alone. I won't lose this. I have worked too hard, sacrificed too much, to let you walk back in here and take it from me with nothing but a story and some tamed animals. They're not tamed, Cale said quietly from the doorway behind her, having followed close enough to hear everything, his voice carrying a weight that made even Maris flinch. They're loyal. There's a difference your family stopped understanding 2 centuries ago, and it's about to cost you considerably more than you think. Maris's hand tightened around the vial, and in the half-second before she moved, Elowen understood. With the particular clarity, the Reach had taught her body to find in moments of danger exactly what her cousin intended to do with the poison she was holding, and exactly how little time there was left to stop her. Maris moved fast, faster than 2 years of court comfort should have allowed, faster than Elowen had braced for, lunging not toward the Duke's bed, but toward Elowen herself, the vial's stopper, already coming free between her fingers, a cornered desperation replacing whatever calculation had guided her for the last 2 years. Elowen felt the old reflexes the Reach had built into her body take over before conscious thought could catch up, twisting aside as the vial's contents splashed harmlessly against the floorboards instead of her skin. And in the same motion caught Maris's wrist and forced it down and back with a strength her cousin had never once had reason to expect from the quiet, overlooked girl she remembered exiling. Guards. Maris shrieked, some old instinct still trying to summon the household authority that had protected her for 2 years. She's attacking me, she's brought monsters into this house too. The household guards who answered that call found instead of the scene Maris was trying to narrate into existence. A duskrunner already blocking the doorway with its hackles raised low and steady, and utterly unwilling to move, and behind it Cale, standing with the particular stillness of something that had spent 2 centuries deciding exactly how much restraint a moment like this deserved. Nobody in this house moves. Cale said, and his voice carried something underneath the words that made even the household's most seasoned guard take an involuntary step backward. Until the Duke of Vaine has heard the whole truth from the mouth of the woman who's been feeding it to him one poisoned cup at a time. Corwin, propped weakly against his pillows, found a strength in his voice that had been entirely absent moments before. Release her, he told the guards, meaning Elowen, and then, turning toward his niece with an expression that had finally completely stopped protecting her, and hold my niece instead. I want the full account, Maris, every letter, every vial. Every year you spent letting me believe I was simply growing old, when you were the one deciding how quickly that dying would go. What followed was not the swift, satisfying violence that 2 years of imagined revenge might have promised Elowen in her angrier moments. It was something slower, and in its own way, considerably more thorough. Maris cornered and finally stripped of every performance that had ever protected her. Unraveled in front of the household staff, the guards and the dying man she had spent a year quietly poisoning, confessing, in a furious, disjointed rush to the maid. She'd blackmailed into planting the vial, the forged letters, the year of carefully measured toxin disguised as evening tea. The quiet redirection of deeds and titles she'd been orchestrating since long before Corwin had ever fallen ill. Elowen let her cousin talk. She had learned in 2 years of watching the kindred navigate their own conflicts that the most complete victories were rarely the ones delivered with a blade. They were the ones that forced the truth into a room it could no longer escape in front of every witness who mattered, until the lie simply had nowhere left to live. She did not need to raise a hand against Maris at all. She only needed to make sure the truth, once spoken, could never again be taken back. You will be tried, Corwin said, once the confession had fully exhausted itself into silence, his voice weak but unwavering, not by a tribunal that decides its verdict before it hears the evidence, the way mine did 2 years ago to my own daughter. You will be tried properly, with the crown's own magistrates, with every letter and every witness Elowen has gathered laid in front of them. And whatever you are found to be, Maris, you will be found to be it honestly, which is more mercy than you ever once extended to the cousin you exiled for a crime you invented yourself. The Crown Prince. Summoned within the hour by a household finally willing to send an honest message, arrived to find his betrothed under armed guard, and his own engagement dissolving in real time in front of a household staff that would within a single evening make certain the entire story reached every corner of the capital by morning. Maris's rise built so carefully over 2 years on borrowed tears, and stolen credit collapsed in the space of a single night, not because Elowen tore it down with monsters and fury, as the old stories about the Ashen Reach might have predicted, but because she had finally given the truth a room it could not be talked out of. The household staff who had once looked away whenever Elowen passed in her final months at Vaine Hall, careful not to be seen showing kindness to the daughter already halfway condemned, found her in the corridor afterward and one by one quietly apologized. Not for anything they had done, most of them, but for everything they hadn't. For the silence they had each kept out of fear of the very woman who now stood under guard. Elowen accepted each apology plainly without theatrics. Because she had learned in the Reach that grace freely given cost her nothing, and occasionally cost the giver everything they had left to offer. And she preferred now to be the kind of person whose mercy did not need to be earned back through groveling to be real. It was, Elowen reflected later, standing at her father's bedside as the household guards led her cousin away, a stranger kind of justice than the one she'd carried across the ward line burning to deliver. It did not feel like triumph. It felt instead like something far more valuable and far harder to counterfeit. It felt like relief. Duke Corwin Vaine lived another 11 months after that night, long enough to see his estate's ledgers untangled from 2 years of Maris's quiet theft. Long enough to formally restore his daughter's name and title in front of the same court that had stripped them from her long enough in the end to say the words he had failed to say on the morning he signed her exile. "I should have asked more questions," he told her in the quiet week before he finally passed, his hand thin and frail in hers. "I should have trusted the daughter I actually knew instead of the fear of a scandal I hadn't. I am sorry it took me 2 years and a poisoned cup of my own to finally see what was standing in front of me the whole time." "You saw it eventually," Elowen told him, and found to her own quiet surprise that she meant the forgiveness in it completely. She had learned in the Ashen Reach that holding onto every old wound indefinitely was its own kind of exile, one she had no interest in sentencing herself to for the rest of her life. Maris's punishment, handed down eventually by the crown's own magistrates rather than a single vengeful hand, was its own kind of poetry. Stripped of title, stripped of the inheritance she'd schemed 2 years to steal, and exiled in a decision the presiding magistrate made with a pointed, deliberate symmetry. Beyond the very ward line she had once been so certain would finish what her lies started. Elowen did not stay to watch her cousin march through that gate. She had spent enough of her life defined by what Maris had done to her. She did not intend to spend what remained of it defined by what happened to Maris in return. She inherited House Vaine formally within the year, restored fully to a name and a title she no longer needed nearly as much as she once believed she did, because the 2 years in the Ashen Reach had taught her something the title itself never could, that her worth had never actually depended on a house's approval, or a court's verdict, or a father's belated apology. It had simply taken all of them far too long to recognize what the forest had seen in a single night. A woman willing to pull an arrow from a dying creature with nothing to gain from the mercy of it. She did not rule from Vaine Hall alone. Cale crossed the ward line with her that final time, not as a conqueror, and not as a monster the kingdom had spent 2 centuries fearing, but as something Threnvale had no history left to properly name, a partner. In the oldest sense the Beast Bond had ever meant restoring a bond between the kingdom and the Ashen Reach that had been severed 200 years before either of them was born. The ward line remained in the years that followed, but the gate no longer stayed locked. And children in Threnvale grew up on a very different set of bedtime stories than the ones that had once sent Elowen through it in chains. Stories about a woman cast out for a crime she never committed, who returned not with vengeance alone, but with an entire forest of loyal, misunderstood creatures at her back, and a truth that no lie, however prettily performed, had ever managed to outrun forever. "They called you a monster's plaything once," Cale told her, standing beside her at the restored gate on the night the old ward wall was formally reopened between their 2 worlds. "What do you want them to call you now?" In the years that followed, the story of what happened at Vaine Hall traveled far beyond Threnvale's borders, retold and reshaped 100 different ways by 100 different tellers, until the details blurred and only the shape of it remained constant. A noblewoman cast out by her own blood, who found in exile not death but a kingdom of her own, and returned not to burn the house that betrayed her to the ground, but to hold it finally to the truth it had spent 2 years trying to outrun. Some versions of the tale called her the Beast Queen. Others called her the woman who controlled monsters, though Elowen herself, Whenever she heard that particular title repeated at some far-flung tavern or market stall, always corrected it quietly to whoever was listening. She had never controlled the kindred at all. She had simply been the first person in 2 centuries willing to listen to them. Elowen looked out at the dark tree line of the Reach and at the lit windows of the kingdom behind her and understood for the first time in her life that she no longer needed anyone else's word for what she was. Whatever they like, she said, I already know.